Okay, so this is Art History 497X again, and Professor Luce here, and we are moving forward on the lessons with for loops. And so most of you, I'm sure, are already there, but just to review, we need to come to Codecademy, log in, click our Learn button, choose JavaScript, and then we are down here in our for loops in JavaScript. And there are 3 sections to this, and we've already done for loops the basics, and so we're going on and practicing loops. And so we've basically gone through the counting exercises now, and we're going to look a little bit closer at how the for loop actually works. So this is basically increasing our literacy and how we understand what it is we're looking at when we look at code in this manner. Because remember, the whole point of code is for us to be able to read it. So how does it work? Well, we've gone through 3 bits of syntax for a for loop, but how exactly does it work? So let's imagine the steps the computer takes to run the loop on the right. So it starts out with I.2. And it actually starts out before that because it starts out with the word for. And for is, remember, a keyword, just like var for variable. So it's telling you there is basically a function going on, right? So, or a little program is going on, right? So for is telling it, you're going to run a loop. And so you're going to look for a certain structure. The computer is going to understand a certain structure. So that's a very important instruction, just that word for. So for, and then like an if-else statement, the next step is the conditional. And so then it's got the set of parentheses in that conditional, and it starts out with I equals 2. It then asks, is I currently less than 13? Because I equals 2, we've just learned that I equals 2, this is true, and so we continue. In other words, the for loop says, okay, loop, go through these conditional statements, check here, where do you start? You start at I2. Does the conditional, right here is that conditional that you're looking at. Is I equals 13? Yes? Okay. Then it doesn't increment. It doesn't go 1, 2, 3. It goes 1, 2, and then to the curly braces, right? Instead, if the condition is met, we run the code block. And remember, code blocks are in curly braces. Here, the code block prints out the value of I. Since I is currently 2, because we're on our first iteration, we will print out 2. Once the code block is finished, then it increments. So it's A, B, C, D. Okay? So now I equals 3. It now goes to B and says, is 3 less than 13? So it only uses this. Remember, that's the start point. This is the end point. But really the way the code works is get me started here, and then it goes here, 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 right? So check the conditional, run the code, increment. Check the conditional, run the code, increment. That's the loop, and that's why it's called a loop. And then you repeat the steps until I is less than 13 is no longer true. So based on that understanding, we have a couple of instructions. Make the computer start counting at 8. We know that goes here. Keep counting while I is less than 120 and count up by increments of 12. No problem. So we want this until, whoops, 120 and count by increments of 12. So we don't want I++, because what does that mean? Okay, you should have answered go up by 1. We don't want it to go up by 1. We want it to go up, so we leave the plus, but we want it to go up by an amount equal to 12. So increments of 12. And then remember, don't crash. We're okay with this. And there we go. So that's nice, right? You know, sometimes that's actually math that my brain gets really tired of doing sometimes, trying to figure out, you know, increments of 3, increments of 7, 5s we got okay, but these odd numbers, sometimes it's hard to go through that multiplication table. Okay, so we're going to keep going here. Practice counting down. For loops only run when the condition is true. So first of all, do not run. Make sure I reset that code so you're looking at the right thing. This is an example of an infinite loop. You might have wondered what on earth would cause that horrible infinite loop that causes the computer to crash. happens a lot. Every time your computer basically hangs and it just seems to stop working, it's managed to create a situation of an infinite loop. That's one of the major reasons why browsers and things like that crash. And so you've experienced this many times before. You just didn't know that perhaps that this is what you were experiencing. So it's very important that the loop end. So let's look and read this and figure out why we've got a infinite loop running here. So we're going to practice our skills at basically reading what it is we're actually telling the computer to do. So we're saying, okay, we're going to do a for loop. Our variable, the counting variable we're using within the for loop, is called I. We're going to start out with I equals 1. And then the conditional that we want to check is that I is greater than or equal to 1. And if it is, then we want it to print the number. And then increment by 1 after that. So do you see the problem with that logic? Why it might cause an infinite loop? You should have answered that there's going to be no end to it because the conditional is met by the initial declaration of the variable I equals 1, right? So it's just going to keep running that, until infinity because you've created a loop with no end, therefore it's an infinite loop, and that will crash your computer. So instructions are change this code such that it starts counting from 10, and we want it to stop counting at 0. We want it to count down by 1. So start it at 10, right? We got that part. We want it to stop counting at 0. That instruction's a little bit vague, but we do have the less than or equal sign there, so we've sidestepped that problem of whether or not 0 prints out. We don't know. We want it to stop counting. Does that mean we want it to print out 0? Not completely sure, but let's assume that's what it wants it to do. And then we want to count down by 1. Well, this is counting up by 1. We don't want it to do that. So we want it to count down by 1, so we can do like that. What would be some alternatives of how you could write that? Okay, good. So hopefully you said something like I minus equals 1 would do it for you as well. Okay, so that should have us all fixed up. Save and submit. And just like we wanted, and indeed they wanted us to stop at 0 but print 0 out, so we got the go ahead to go forward. Okay, last practice of for loop. You have a great handle. Sorry, reset my code there. You have a great handle on for loops. This will be the last practice one before we look at cool ways to use them. The next exercise introduces you to arrays. So instead of just counting numbers up and down, we can make the computer do many more interesting things with loops. Once more for practice, write a for loop that gets the computer to count down from 100 to 0 by 5s. All right, so here we go. How do I start? Okay, hopefully said we need to start by typing the word for. That's correct. And what's the very next step of a for loop? One way you can always sort of key yourself to make sure you're using all the parts of a program correctly or all the parts of a command correctly. Remember, the for loop has two sections to it. It has the conditional and then it has the code block, right? So one thing that you can do is sort of set up the structure for yourself. So you know that this is what it's supposed to do. And we know, for instance, that in the code block, what we're going to want is to console log, right? Because we want it to print out those numbers that we're counting down. So we want it to do something like that, yeah? And then inside here, the first thing, remember, that you do is you have to declare your counting variable. So you start out a for loop by saying variable, var, and we're going to call the counting variable I. And then we want to say counts down from 100 to 0 by 5s. So var I, what's our starting number? I hope you said 100. And remember, the next bit is with a semicolon. So start down to a 0. So then we need a conditional. Remember, this middle part is the conditional statement. So what conditional statement do you want to put there? Okay, hopefully you came up with something like for I greater than 0. Yeah, so check to see that I is greater than 0. And then we need the part that actually manipulates what I does. So what do you think for that one? Okay, so hopefully you came up with something like I minus equals 5. So decrease I by a group of 5, right? Or subtract 5 from whatever I is. So let's look at this and make sure we make sense. We're going to start out at 100. So long as I is greater than 0, we want it to run the program. Now, do we have an increment that's going to actually make sure that we get that lower number? And yes, we do, because we have take I and decrease it by 5. Yeah? So this is what you're going to increment. This is the action that you're doing. This is the condition that has to be met, and this is where we're going to be starting. And what do we want it to do? We want it to console log I, and I had my little delinter there because I needed my semicolon. Okay, I think that looks good. And there we go. All right, and that is the last part of this section. And so now we've completed parts 1 and 2. That's the end of practicing loops.